began in the wreckage of empires and the quiet collapse of certainty. Europe, once crowned in stone fortresses and papal decrees, now stirred restlessly beneath the weight of its own decay. For centuries, men had obeyed. They tilled the fields, feared the sword, repeated the same words in the same halls, and died without their names ever touching parchment. Knowledge was hoarded, beauty shackled, and curiosity feared. But something was changing, and no one could stop it. The plague had come and left its mark like fire on parchment. Across towns and valleys, silence replaced song. 1/3 of the population had vanished into the earth, and what was left behind was not only grief, but space. Empty space. Space for questions. Space for change. The old systems were crumbling. Nobles dead. Monasteries hollow. The chains of feudalism, once locked tight, began to rust and loosen. In the aftermath, people did not return to what was. They looked elsewhere. To the ruins of forgotten worlds, to the philosophers of stone, carved columns, to the poets whose verses had not been sung for 1,000 years. In dusty vaults and broken scrolls, they discovered voices that spoke not of obedience, but of reason, proportion, and human potential. The soil of northern Italy, once watered with blood and taxes, now grew something strange of freedom. In Florence, Genoa, Milan, and Venice, wealth began to flow like the Arno itself. Trade routes opened wide, silk and spice coursing into Europe's ports from the east and the south. Merchants grew rich, and with their gold came ambition, not only to build walls, but to build legacies. And to do that, they needed artists. They needed thinkers. In workshops dimly lit by candlelight, a revolution began, not with swords, but with brushes, chisels, and the written word. This was the dawn of the Renaissance, not a storm, but a rising tide. And its first ripples moved through the minds of men who refused to forget. They remembered Greece. They remembered Rome. And they remembered that civilization could be more than surviving. A new class emerged, one not born of lineage, but of intellect and daring. Scholars, bankers, sculptors, physicians. Those who asked not what had always been, but what might be. In Florence, the Medici family rose from textile trade into quiet kingship, not through war, but through patronage. They funded thinkers and painters the way kings once funded crusades. In their salons and libraries, conversations sparked like flint against steels about law, light, anatomy, beauty, the soul, and the stars. Humanism took root, not as a rebellion against religion, but as a reclamation of man's dignity. The idea spread that humans were not mere vessels of guilt or fate, but beings of reason and design. That the world could be understood, mapped, questioned. That the body was not shameful, but miraculous. Artists sketched corpses to learn their secrets. Architects studied Roman ruins to rebuild cities that could breathe again. Suddenly, language shifted. Latin remained, but vernacular voices began to rise. In Italy, Dante had already walked through the circles of the imagined inferno, speaking not in Latin, but in the tongue of his people. In Petrarch's writings, longing and reason danced together on the edge of every page. Boccaccio painted the world of the living with humour, pain, and scandal, all of it human, all of it bold. As Florence became the pulse of this movement, other cities watched and followed. The spirit of renewal, of Rinascita, moved like wind through stone corridors. Guilds trained apprentices not only in trade, but in geometry and proportion. Wealthy families commissioned paintings not only of saints, but of themselves. Statues emerged in public squares, proud and muscular, carved not as symbols of divine wrath, but of human triumph. The shift was profound, and yet almost silent. No armies marched under Renaissance banners. No declarations rang through town squares. And yet, Europe was waking up. The questions being asked were not loud, but they were dangerous. What if we have been wrong? What if there is more? What if we can shape the world, not simply endure it? And still, beneath the surface, the old powers held on. The church watched. Monarchs tightened their grip. But they could not stop the shift, because it did not wear armor. It wore robes, carried scrolls, and spoke in the voice of thought itself. This was not yet the Renaissance of Da Vinci or Michelangelo, not yet the printed book or the telescope pointed at the sky. This was the foundation, the turning of the soil, the breath before the song. Europe was no longer still. The candle was lit, and the dark could not hold forever. The Renaissance did not begin with genius. It began with hunger. A hunger not of the stomach, but of the spirit. And it spread quietly, threading its way through streets lined with stone and dust, through universities reborn in breath, through hands stained with ink and pigment and ambition. The air was changing, and though no one yet called it revolution, the world was already tilting. Florence, radiant and rebellious, sat like a glowing ember at the heart of this shift. It was not the grandest city in Europe, but it pulsed with something other places lacked movement. Its bridges carried not just people, but ideas. Its marketplaces buzzed not only with goods, but with stories. And its palaces, guarded by families who once clawed power from silk and trade, became temples to a new kind of influence, the influence of thought. The Medici family rose not by sword, but by calculation. They understood that power in this new age flowed through gold and talent. They funded thinkers, artists, architects. They hosted poets. They debated with astronomers. And with every coin placed into a painter's palm or a philosopher's pen, they carved their name into something larger than politics. They carved it into history. It was here that the idea of man began to shift, no longer a fragile soul clinging to survival. Man was now a question worth asking. What is the measure of a human? Can he sculpt beauty? Can he unlock the workings of the heavens? Can he rewrite laws and map the body and frame the world in marble and melody? In this spirit, the artist emerged from the shadows of anonymity. Where once the sculptor had been a servant, now he became a name. Giotto, Donatello, Brunelleschi. These were not mere craftsmen. They were architects of perspective. They shaped vision itself. They dared to bend space, to manipulate light, to draw the eye into imagined depth. And in doing so, they changed how people saw the world, and themselves within it. This transformation was not confined to Florence alone. In Padua, Bologna, and Siena, whispers of change grew louder. Universities reawakened. In Paris and Prague, in Oxford and Salamanca, students studied not only scripture, but law, language, medicine, and classical texts preserved in Arabic and Greek, retranslated and revived. The crosswinds of trade brought more than spices and silks. They brought manuscripts. They brought architecture from the East, mathematics from the scholars of Al-Andalus, navigational instruments from the shores of Alexandria. The compass pointed not just to the sea, but to progress. And as this intellectual ferment spread, a subtle defiance grew. No longer did learning bow entirely to authority. A physician might dissect a body not for doctrine, but for truth. An architect might draw not for a cathedral, but for the shape of man. A poet might write not to appease, but to stir. It was not rebellion yet, not open, but it was no longer silence either. The church still ruled. Thrones were still divine, but cracks had formed, and through them, the Renaissance seeped. Paper grew cheaper, ink blowed across borders. The hands that once trembled before the parchment now dared to write of desire, of reason, of motion and mind. The printing press had not yet come, but the craving for permanence was already there. In Florence's back rooms and upper halls, artists learned anatomy from cadavers, drew muscle onto marble. They studied the arc of the sky to paint it with realism. They captured grief, awe, and triumph in the stroke of a brush. Their work spoke of life, not only divine, but human. Perspective, that most revolutionary of tricks, was more than geometry. It was philosophy. It implied that the world could be measured, understood, recreated. That the eye was worthy of trust. That illusion, when mastered, could speak deeper truths than sermons. This thinking rippled into politics too. Republics in Italy, fragile, shifting, corrupt though they were, fostered voices. In Florence, a citizen could debate, could petition, could write. In Venice, the Senate listened. In Milan, courts competed to host the brightest. The Renaissance was not perfect. It was not pure. But it was powerful. It built itself not by erasing what came before, but by daring to imagine what could follow. And in every corner of its rise, the past was not forgotten. It was reforged. Scribes pored over Plato and Aristotle, but also over newly discovered Roman legal codes and architectural plans. Every ruin became a textbook, every crumbling arch a question. Why had the ancients done this? Could we do it again? Could we do it better? And so, piece by piece, the old world became scaffolding for the new. Men wrote of justice, not just judgment. They wrote of beauty, not just sin. They sculpted gods, yes, but gave them the faces of men they admired. The Renaissance was not secular. Not yet. But it was terrestrial. It brought heaven's gaze down to earth and painted what it saw. By the end of the 14th century, the pattern was clear. Something had shifted. Art no longer clung to the walls of monasteries alone. It adorned the homes of bankers, the tombs of merchants, the fountains of public squares. Education spread beyond the clergy. Philosophy left the cloister. The Renaissance had become not a movement, but a mood, a way of seeing, a way of daring. It was only the beginning. The minds that would shatter the heavens and redraw the maps of the world were not yet born. The books that would shake the foundations of power had not yet been printed, but the soil had been turned, and the first green shoots had broken through. Europe was no longer sleepwalking. It was waking, and what it would dream into being next would shake the very shape of time. Florence was not built for empires, nor blessed with vast lands or fleets. Yet in the 15th century, it stood at the center of the world, not through conquest, but through mind and motion. Nestled along the Arno River, surrounded by Tuscan hills that seemed to fold like parchment, Florence rose like a jewel forged by tension. It was a city divided by class, scarred by politics, constantly bracing for conflict. And yet, from that very unrest, came brilliance. The city's foundation was laid not on stone, but on competition. Guilds jostled for dominance. Families vied for legacy. Pride was currency, and ambition was law. But Florence's genius was not in silencing this noise. It was in turning it into music. The city channeled rivalry into art, tension into architecture, and ego into eternity. At the heart of this transformation stood the Medici family, bankers with the instinct of kings and the vision of poets. They understood that true influence was not measured in armies, but in ideas that endured. And so they patronized not just artists, but architects, scientists, philosophers, and scholars. Cosimo di Medici opened libraries. Piero funded sculpture. Lorenzo the Magnificent surrounded himself with minds that would define the age. Under their watch, Florence became a laboratory of beauty and thought. Brunelleschi, the man who once lost a sculpture competition, turned defeat into destiny. He studied ancient Roman ruins with obsessive devotion, measured domes that no longer stood, and dreamed of one greater. When others said it could not be done, he raised the dome of Santa Maria del Fiore. Not just a church, but a message of the impossible was now on the table. Meanwhile, in workshops hidden behind unmarked doors, apprentices mixed pigments from minerals and ash, stretched canvas, carved marble. Here, Donatello redefined sculpture, breathing movement into stone. His figures stood not as saints alone, but as beings filled with tension, grace, and thought. His bronze David was not a divine hero, but a youth, contemplative, confident, human. Painters like Masaccio stepped into this evolving space with brush in hand and fire in mind. In his hands, perspective became scripture. His frescoes in the Brancacci chapel captured shadow, depth, and emotion in a way the world had not seen in 1,000 years. The eye no longer wandered. It was guided, drawn, immersed. Florence was not just painting pictures, it was inventing vision. And yet, the Renaissance was never confined to technique. It was also about language, and how it could reshape identity. In the Florence of the Medici, Latin remained the tool of scholars, but the vernacular became the voice of soul. Dante, before the century had even turned, had already written the Divine Comedy in the Tuscan tongue, lifting the dialect into literature, placing his people's voice into the eternal canon. He walked through imagined hell and heaven. Yes, but his true journey was giving language back to the people. After him, Petrarch and Boccaccio deepened that path. Petrarch wrote letters not as rituals, but as confessions. He mourned Rome, yes, but also craved the future. Boccaccio, with his Decameron, unveiled the wit, sin, and beauty of everyday lives. His stories were not sermons, they were mirrors, and Florence, both scandalous and sublime, saw itself in them. Beneath the palaces, beneath the paintings, something deeper was stirring, a belief that the individual mattered, that reason and beauty were not at odds, that legacy could be carved by hand and brush, not just by crown or creed. Florence was not content with being remembered. It demanded to be studied, envied, copied. Still, this wasn't paradise. Power was fragile. Families turned on each other. Exiles were common. Streets knew blood as well as gold. But even this chaos became part of the alchemy. It sharpened the city, made it restless. And from restlessness came invention. Education flourished, not just in law or theology, but in the classical disciplines rhetoric, ethics, logic. Schools taught Cicero, Aristotle, and Euclid. Young men recited Plato and sketched geometry into the margins of their notebooks. The line between scholar and artist blurred, and through this fusion, Florence birthed minds that would shape the world. Among them walked a young apprentice named Leonardo da Vinci, not yet the icon, but already watching, sketching, asking questions no one else dared to speak aloud. In the shadows of Santa Croce and the corners of the Medici court, a generation was gathering, one that would redraw the map of thought itself. Florence, for all its flaws, had built something no army could conquer. An idea, a flame, and as word of it travelled, in letters, in portraits, in sculpture, the world leaned closer. Florence was never still. Even in its golden years, it moved like a river, slow in moments, torrential in others, but never stagnant. And within that current, ideas collided, sharpened, and bloomed. Here, genius was not an accident of birth, but a consequence of proximity. You breathed the same air as poets, brushed shoulders with sculptors, bought bread from men debating Plato. Art was not tucked away in palaces. It lived in public squares, clung to chapel walls, and echoed through the stone corridors of everyday life. The 15th century brought a flowering, unlike anything Europe had seen in centuries. At the heart of it were men whose names would etch themselves into marble and memory, not for the battles they won, but for the visions they birthed. Leon Battista Alberti, architect and polymath, saw buildings as language. His churches were not merely houses of worship, they were studies in harmony, rhythm, and proportion. He wrote of perspective as a science, of beauty as a thing measurable and teachable. He believed architecture could elevate the soul, not through fear, but through clarity. And then came the artists who needed no manifestos. Their work was their argument. Fra Angelico, a Dominican friar, painted walls with ethereal calm. His frescoes glowed with serenity, geometry balanced against colour, humility wrapped in gold. Yet even in their quiet grace, his figures carried depth, the weight of reflection, the ache of thought. In nearby studios, Andrea del Verrocchio trained a generation. One of his pupils was Leonardo, a boy with no surname of power, no birthright, but an eye unlike any other. Leonardo observed everything, the way muscles flexed under skin, the way birds curved through air, the way water split around rock. He filled notebooks with dissections, inventions, questions. To him, art was science, and science was art. The world was not to be worshipped from afar, but to be unravelled, measured, reimagined. And Florence gave him room to do it. Nowhere else in Europe could a man question so freely, so publicly, so boldly, provided he wrapped his curiosity in beauty. That was the trick. To critique without defying. To remake the world without declaring war on it. The Renaissance mind understood that persuasion was as powerful as rebellion. A fresco could shake an empire more quietly than a sword ever could. In every street, the conversation continued. Not in cafes, but in guild halls and lecture rooms. Philosophy was discussed as trade, logic as commerce, the studia humanitatis, grammar, rhetoric, poetry, history, and moral philosophy became the core of education. This was not the learning of rote memorization, but of engagement. Debate was not sin, it was sport. And within that atmosphere, artists became not servants but partners. Filippo Lippi painted the divine with sensuality. His Madonnas smiled not with piety, but with humanity. Botticelli, delicate and daring, painted the birth of Venus with myth, motion, and mystery. His works danced on the edge of the sacred and the profane, celebrating form with such grace that even skeptics bowed. But Florence's Renaissance wasn't confined to paint and stone. It was also economic, legal, political. The Republic's structure, fragile and often corrupt, still allowed for civic participation. Citizens debated laws. Courts employed scholars. Banking systems grew increasingly sophisticated, writing letters of credit that stretched across continents. The Florentine ducat became a symbol of trust, its weight backed not just by gold, but by reputation. And reputation in Florence was a currency of its own. Artists signed their work now. Scholars published treatises under their own names. To be known was to endure. Legacy mattered. Tomes were sculpted not in anonymity, but with lineage in mind. The idea of the self was emerging. Not the selfish self, but the self as center of experience, interpretation, and action. Yet Florence was not immune to contradiction. Its tolerance had limits. Its debates sometimes turned to exile. Girolamo Savonarola would soon rise, preaching fire and purity, burning books, and calling for a return to moral austerity. The pendulum would swing. But for this moment, this radiant window in time, Florence was a furnace of thought, glowing with potential. What made it different was not wealth alone. Other cities had coin. It was not faith. Others prayed. It was not peace. Florence was often at war with itself. What made Florence unique was its synthesis. It took conflict and made it creative. It took anxiety and made it articulate. It took ambition and painted it across ceilings. The city dared to believe that the mind could shape the world. That art could be both beautiful and true. That knowledge was not merely inherited, but built. And in doing so, it set a precedent that would echo across Europe. From the shadows of feudalism, Florence had carved a beacon, and its light, refracted through canvas, marble, verse, and theory, would soon illuminate the world beyond its walls. In the golden heart of the Renaissance, the canvas became a battlefield, not of blood, but of legacy. It was no longer enough to simply paint saints or carve stone. Art had to breathe. It had to move. It had to capture the pulse of a world waking from 1,000-year sleep. And at the forefront of this transformation stood men who did not merely depict humanity. They redefined it. Leonardo da Vinci, born out of wedlock in a quiet village near Florence, stepped into history not with fanfare, but with observation. His genius was slow, deliberate, all-consuming. He saw not with awe, but with inquiry. The curl of a lip, the flex of a tendon, the shadows cast by candlelight. To him, they were not decoration, but answers waiting to be revealed. In his Vitruvian Man, he mapped the proportions of the human body with divine precision, echoing Roman architect Vitruvius, but adding something new. The assertion that man himself was the measure of all things. It was philosophy rendered in ink, the body made into theorem. His paintings followed suit. The Last Supper, with its swirling composition and psychological nuance, froze time. Mona Lisa, cloaked in mystery, smiled across centuries, her gaze haunted by secrets no brush should hold. But Leonardo was not alone in his mastery. Across Florence and Rome, another force had risen. Younger, fiery, thunderous. Michelangelo Buonarroti was a sculptor first, born with fists clenched around a chisel. Where Leonardo studied the world through science, Michelangelo attacked it through form. To him, marble was not stone, but a prison, one that held within it divine beauty, struggling to emerge. His David stood not as a boy who felled a giant, but as the embodiment of Renaissance confidence. Muscles coiled, brow furrowed, eyes locked, a human poised for greatness carved from the earth itself. It was not merely sculpture. It was a declaration, a challenge. Then came the Sistine Chapel, commissioned against his will, painted lying on scaffolding for years. Michelangelo turned the ceiling of the Vatican into a universe. It burst with creation fury, shame, wonder. Adam's languid hand reaching for the divine, fingers nearly touching, became the most iconic gesture in Western art. And all of it flowed from one man, alone, suffocating in paint, wrestling with time. Yet even as these giants worked, another artist was redefining grace with every stroke. Raphael Sanzio, the youngest of the three, entered the scene like a breeze. Soft, elegant, precise. Trained in Urbino, sharpened in Florence, he brought balance where others brought force. In the school of Athens, he placed Plato and Aristotle beneath Roman arches, surrounded by philosophers old and new, capturing not only beauty but dialogue, motion, intellect. Raphael's Madonnas became the model of maternal calm, their faces gentle, their eyes clear. His compositions danced between heaven and earth, capturing the peace Michelangelo raged against, and the ease Leonardo never trusted. And in this contrast, his work sang. These three names, Leonardo, Michelangelo, Raphael, became the pillars of Renaissance art. But they were not alone in the forge. Titian, in Venice, drenched his paintings in colour, mastering oil with such depth it glowed from within. Giovanni Bellini, his teacher, had already begun this path, turning light into language. Georgian, ephemeral and mysterious, painted with poetry, dying young but leaving echoes. Their works shifted the axis of art. Human emotion, once flattened by medieval constraint, now surged. Fear, desire, melancholy, triumph, guilt, ecstasy. These were no longer sins to be suppressed, but truths to be explored. A glance could carry a paragraph. A hand could tremble with meaning. A nude could be not only exposed, but understood. Perspective, first studied in Florence, became a weapon in their arsenal. With it, artists bent space, crafted illusions, built cathedrals in oil. Figures stepped forward from the walls, eyes met the viewers across centuries. Art became immersive, intimate, alive. Anatomy, too, was revolutionized. Artists dissected bodies in secret, sketching muscle and sinew with monastic detail. They learned the way a foot bore weight, how a shoulder rolled in motion, how flesh curved in light. This wasn't morbid fascination. It was reverence. The body was no longer shameful. It was the most complex architecture ever built. And through this exploration, the Renaissance sculptor and painter became philosophers in their own right. They questioned form. They chased perfection. They documented life not as it was, but as it could be. Idealized, dramatized, yet undeniably human. These masters were not saints. They bickered. They competed. Michelangelo accused Raphael of stealing. Leonardo wrote little of his rivals, but drew circles around his own brilliance. And yet their rivalry fueled a golden era. One masterpiece pushed the next. Each fresco, each statue, each sketch became a conversation with history. Patrons played their part, too. Popes, dukes, bankers. They funded art as proof of power, glory, sophistication. They carved their faces into altarpieces, commissioned grandeur for private chapels. But what they enabled was larger than ego. They laid the groundwork for a visual language that would echo through galleries, textbooks, and screens for centuries. In the hands of these masters, the Renaissance reached its full visual roar. Walls sang, marble breathed, canvas trembled, and through it all, Europe watched, spellbound, forever changed. By the early 1500s, art in Europe was no longer just a craft. It was identity. It clothed power, defined city pride, and shaped how civilizations saw themselves. The Renaissance had unshackled creativity from the church pew and placed it in the hands of individuals. Artists were no longer unknown hands behind altar screens. They were thinkers, personalities, voices. And in the cities of Florence, Rome, and Venice, their visions now bled into politics, philosophy, and even diplomacy. The works of Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Raphael had not only changed what art could look like, they changed what it could mean. No longer simply devotional, art had become narrative, psychological, and increasingly secular. A fresco could now carry coded political messages. A sculpture could reflect the ideals of a republic. A portrait could whisper the status, ambition, and intellect of a family long after its last heir had died. In Florence, the Medici returned from exile and reclaimed their place not just through coin, but through visual legacy. Cosimo I. de' Medici commissioned grand architectural projects, ordered fountains, filled villas with symbolism and strategy. Artists became architects of memory. Their paint was power. In Rome, under the patronage of Pope Julius II and later Pope Leo X, Michelangelo and Raphael reached their zenith. Michelangelo's Moses, carved with muscle and fury, glared from the tomb of Julius like a thundercloud frozen in marble. In the Sistine Chapel, his ceiling still breathed with the myths of beginnings. But years later, in the Last Judgment, painted behind the altar, the tone had darkened. Bodies twisted in torment. Judgment thundered from the sky. The Renaissance, once filled with clarity and balance, now braced for shadows. Raphael, meanwhile, decorated the stands di Raffaello, rooms within the Vatican Palace, filling them with serene allegories of knowledge, philosophy, law, and poetry. In the school of Athens, he placed ancient philosophers under one dome, but rendered their faces as his contemporaries. Plato became Leonardo. Heraclitus bore Michelangelo's scowl. Himself, too, he painted in the corner, the observer within the scene. It was a subtle proclamation. Art had joined the ranks of thought. But it wasn't just Italy anymore. The Renaissance had crossed the Alps. In Germany, Albrecht Dürer merged northern precision with Italian vision. He travelled to Venice, absorbed their techniques, and returned home wielding oil like fire. His self-portraits, stark and symmetrical, looked straight at the viewer with unsettling confidence. His engravings, dense with detail, layered in meaning, turned the printing press into a gallery. Art was no longer only for cathedrals and courts. It could now be owned, copied, studied. In the Netherlands, Jan van Eyck had already laid groundwork decades earlier. His Arnolfini portrait, with its mirror, its oranges, its delicate light, was a still life of subtle symbolism, a manifesto of realism. Hieronymus Bosch, on the other hand, painted nightmares, writhing worlds filled with monsters and sin. His work was chaotic, wild, and deeply moral, showing how the Northern Renaissance would chart its own path, darker and more psychological. In France, Jean Fouquet painted faces with icy precision. In Spain, painters began experimenting with light and mysticism. And across the continent, the Renaissance spread, adapted, translated, personalized. Artists were now seen as cultural diplomats. They traveled with their patrons, were gifted between courts. They observed foreign dress, architecture, gesture. In return, they left behind frescoes, tapestries, etchings, breadcrumbs of beauty stretching from Iberia to Hungary. Back in Italy, the tide was changing. The high point of harmony and clarity had passed. The late Renaissance, or mannerism, began to stretch figures unnaturally, distort perspective, inject emotion into balance. Art now felt tense, exaggerated, theatrical. It mirrored a world unsettled by war, politics, and the looming questions that the next century would explode. Still, the legacy of the High Renaissance remained. Its masters had pushed the boundaries of the human figure. Light, color, anatomy, space, and meaning. They had established that the artist was not merely a hand, but a mind, capable of commentary, invention, and defiance. And it wasn't just in grand chapels and princely halls that this transformation was visible. It was in the books people read, the gardens they walked, the clothing they wore, the languages they spoke. Art had seeped into everything, and with it, the Renaissance had reshaped not just how Europe created, but how it lived. Before the Renaissance, knowledge moved slowly, handwritten on fragile vellum, guarded in monasteries, chained to tables. Books were rare, sacred, expensive. A single volume could cost more than a farm. They were copied by candlelight, one letter at a time, by monks whose hands often trembled with fatigue. A mistake meant a correction with a knife, scraping the parchment clean. Only the elite, clergy, scholars, and nobility, had access to written thought. For the rest, knowledge passed through word, myth, and memory. But in the mid-15th century, a whisper began to stir across Europe, a whisper forged in metal and ink. In Mainz, Germany, Johannes Gutenberg built a machine that would fracture history in silence. The movable, type printing press. It was not the first attempt. The Chinese and Koreans had used wooden or ceramic blocks centuries earlier. But Gutenberg's genius lay in perfecting the method for Europe. casting letters in lead alloy, building uniformity, designing a press based on wine presses used in his region. It was mechanical, reproducible, durable, and most importantly, it was fast. His first great triumph was the Gutenberg Bible, printed around 1455. It was not just a religious milestone. It was an aesthetic one. Each page, beautifully set, held 2 columns of 42 lines. Illuminated initials were painted to mimic tradition, but the text was uniform. It whispered a new truth. Knowledge could now be duplicated. Once books could be copied without needing scribes, everything changed. Words no longer had to wait for permission. Ideas traveled not in bags or songs, but in stacks of printed paper. A book could now reach dozens, then hundreds, then thousands. The bottleneck was broken. Suddenly, scholars were no longer isolated. Thinkers across cities and borders could respond to each other in real time. Letters became dialogues. Essays became arguments. And soon, controversy began to burn like a slow fire. In Italy, Aldus Manutius opened the Aldine Press in Venice, creating pocket-sized books for scholars on the move. He standardized punctuation, introduced the italic typeface, and spread Greek and Latin classics like wildfire. Education was no longer confined to lecture halls or cathedral schools. It was portable, personal, and increasingly practical. In Germany, Martin Luther watched the press with both fascination and precision. When he nailed his 95 theses to the door of Wittenberg's church, the act was symbolic, but it was the printed copies that shook the world. They spread through the Holy Roman Empire like wind-borne sparks. In weeks, they were everywhere. His words were not contained by clergy or kings. The press had turned rebellion into replication. But the printing press did not only empower protest, it elevated the very act of thinking. The humanists, with their hunger for classical wisdom, saw the press as a gift from the past. Desiderius Erasmus, Pico della Mirandola, and Marsilio Ficino all saw their works published, dissected, argued. Ancient Greek texts, once known only through whispers or fragments, were now bound in Latin and sent across Europe. Plato was reborn. Aristotle challenged once again. Cicero spoke to new ears, and people read. The educated elite were no longer alone in their libraries. Merchants read books on navigation. Midwives learned new methods. Artists studied anatomy from printed diagrams. Even farmers began reading almanacs, weather predictions, treatises on planting. In towns and cities, bookstores appeared beside markets. Libraries opened their doors. Literacy began to grow, first among the wealthy, then the middling class, then those on the edges of power. The press democratized curiosity, but with freedom came danger. Authorities soon realized that the press could not be easily controlled. Heresy, satire, and sedition now traveled in the same format as gospel and science. To print a lie was as easy as printing the truth. And so, censorship emerged. Inquisitions watched closely. Indexes of forbidden books appeared. Printers were jailed, sometimes executed. Pages were burned. But even then, the ideas were already out. One of the greatest impacts of printing came in language. With more people reading, writers began to abandon Latin in favor of the vernacular. German, Italian, French, and English became literary languages. Books now spoke the tongue of the people. And with that shift came identity. A Florentine was no longer just a subject of Tuscany. He was Italian. A Londoner did not just pray in Latin. He thought in English. The spread of language through print laid the groundwork for nationalism, for shared myths and memory. People who had never met began to imagine themselves as part of the same story. And with that, Europe began to grow noisier and sharper. The printed word had unleashed something Europe had not anticipated. Momentum, and once in motion, ideas refused to return to silence. Every page turned was a ripple. Every book sold a spark. And soon, those sparks became fires. It began in the realm of religion, where authority had long rested on ancient manuscripts, Latin sermons, and centralized control. But now, translations of sacred texts began to appear, not in the elite's Latin, but in the tongues of everyday people. German, French, English. Once reserved for priests and scholars, the scripture was now within reach of cobblers and innkeepers. Martin Luther understood the press better than anyone. His tracts, sermons, and letters were designed for reproduction. Short, sharp, emotional. They fit the format and flared the flame. With the press at his back, the Protestant Reformation could not be contained. Pamphlets flew through towns like arrows. Debates happened in taverns, not just universities. The pulpit no longer had a monopoly on truth. But rebellion wasn't the only fruit of printing. Science, too, found new life. Copernicus, cautious and methodical, published De Revolutionibus Orbium, Coelestium, near the end of his life, suggesting that the sun, not the earth, stood at the center. The book travelled far beyond his reach. Tycho Brahe and Johannes Kepler would read, question, build upon it. Ideas once buried in monastic scrolls now danced across Europe, stitched into diagrams and notes. Andreas Vesalius, in De Humani Corporis Fabrica, dissected not only bodies, but dogma. His printed anatomical studies, illustrated in precise woodcuts, shattered centuries of Galenic assumptions. The body, long considered sacred, untouchable, was now studied, understood, and corrected. These books weren't mere curiosities. They were revolutions, bound in leather and ink. Galileo Galilei, too, felt the press's double edge. His telescope showed moons orbiting Jupiter, spots blemishing the sun, and phases on Venus, all confirming Copernicus. His dialogue concerning the two chief world systems was printed in vernacular Italian. It reached not only the scholars in Rome, but the merchants in Florence. The church watched and warned. Galileo was tried, his book banned. But the words were already out. The press empowered memory, too. Events could now be recorded with consistency. Chronicles, once full of exaggeration and silence, gained structure. News began to emerge. Newsletters, broadsheets, bulletins. The ancestors of journalism. People no longer relied solely on hearsay. They read of battles, discoveries, executions, and coronations. The world became a little smaller, a little faster, and with this acceleration came power. Kings and rulers saw the threat, but also the opportunity. Some funded presses to control narrative. Others outlawed them altogether. The printed page became a political tool. Edicts were copied and distributed. Propaganda found new form. Control was no longer won solely on battlefields, but on paper. Education shifted too. Universities, once islands of cloistered thought, opened new disciplines. Students read Aristotle and Aquinas, yes, but also new treatises on anatomy, astronomy, and logic. Curricula expanded. Libraries grew. The very concept of being educated changed from memorization to investigation. The press also shifted culture. It nurtured new genres, essays, satire, prose fiction. Writers experimented. Thinkers corresponded. The idea of a public emerged, not just in marketplaces, but in thought. People began to consider themselves part of broader conversations. In religion, in politics, in science, the idea of Europe was being written, one book at a time, and all of it came with cost. The flood of texts brought noise. Not every book held truth. Misinformation, scandal, superstition. All found fertile ground. Censorship sharpened. Wars of ideology spread. The printed word became both weapon and cure. But despite chaos, the net effect was transformation. The press didn't just change how ideas moved. It changed what ideas were possible. It made thought faster, memory longer, rebellion louder, truth more complex. Before Gutenberg, a single book was a monument. After him, a book was a voice, and Europe was learning to listen and speak. They did not ride horses into battle. They carried no swords. They built no chapels and painted no ceilings. But the thinkers of the Renaissance wielded tools, just as sharp, just as transformative. The pen, the pamphlet, the public letter. Their battleground was the mind, their war, the future of how men ruled, believed, and behaved. Europe, now pulsing with print and artistic vision, was ready for a new kind of hero, the political realist, the moral philosopher, the humanist provocateur. In Florence, as the golden age of art reached its twilight, Niccolò Machiavelli stepped forward, equal parts patriot and cynic, diplomat and exile. He had served the Florentine Republic, watched it fall, seen princes lie, empires rot, and alliances shift with the wind. When the Medici returned to power, Machiavelli was dismissed, imprisoned, tortured, and cast into the countryside. There, in forced solitude, he wrote The Prince. It was not a manual of cruelty, as later critics claimed, but a mirror held up to power. Gone were the idealistic visions of virtue-driven rule. In their place, a brutal clarity. A ruler, Machiavelli argued, must be loved or feared, preferably both, but never neither. He must protect the state even at the cost of his soul. Deceit, manipulation, boldness. These were tools of survival, not sins. To Machiavelli, the world was not what it should be, but what it was. And a prince who failed to see that would lose everything. Across the Alps, a different voice emerged, smoother, subtler, and wrapped in wit. Desiderius Erasmus, born in Rotterdam, trained by monks, wrote in polished Latin and smiled through his satire. In the praise of folly, he mocked the pride of scholars, the corruption of priests, the absurdity of empty ceremony. He believed in reform, not revolt. Erasmus wanted to cleanse the church, not crush it. He believed knowledge could refine men, that reason could guide faith. He and Luther corresponded briefly, each testing the other's resolve. Erasmus stepped back from violence. Luther leaned into it. But Erasmus' influence lingered, not in thunder but in rain. Soft, steady, nourishing. In England, Thomas More, a friend of Erasmus, dreamed aloud in utopia. An island of reason, order, and communal living. A vision that questioned everything Europe had accepted about justice, property, and morality. The book was part satire, part warning, part hope. It asked, what if we are the fools? What if there's a better way? More would later serve as Chancellor under Henry V, a post that would cost him his life when he refused to betray his conscience. His head fell to the axe, but his words lived on. Meanwhile in France, Michel de Montaigne began to write essays, a word he invented to describe his reflections. He did not claim truth, he searched for it. Montaigne questioned everything, himself most of all. Why do we fear death? What is a good life? Can we trust our senses? He wandered through his mind as others wandered through cities. He did not build systems. He mapped uncertainty. And in doing so, he helped invent the modern self. These thinkers, scattered across courts and cloisters, were linked by one thread: humanism. But humanism was no doctrine. It was a lens. It meant believing that humans, through study and reason, could improve themselves and their societies. It meant returning to the ancients not as idols, but as dialogue partners, to read Cicero and argue with him, to study Plato and not only quote him, but question him. Humanism changed education. It shifted focus from abstract theology to rhetoric, history, ethics, and grammar. It trained men not just to pray, but to persuade, to lead, to write. In cities like Padua and Bologna, in universities like Paris and Salamanca, the Studia Humanitatis replaced scholastic rigidity. It was less about memorizing doctrine, more about cultivating judgment. And as these ideas spread, they shaped not just how people thought, but how they governed. Kings began hiring advisors who read Virgil, not just scriptures. Diplomats carried Cicero in their saddlebags. Courts debated law not only in terms of divine right, but precedent, equity, and civic good. The Renaissance mind, armed with old texts and new printing, began to imagine politics as craft, not just inheritance. But with all this brilliance came tension. What was the purpose of thought if it never left the page? What did it mean to know, but not act? Could virtue survive in a world shaped by power? The thinkers of the Renaissance didn't agree. They argued. They contradicted. They edited. Some believed in the perfectibility of man, others in his folly. Some trusted reason, others trusted instinct. But all of them believed in the power of words. Words could reform the church. Words could rewrite law. Words could stop kings or stir revolutions. The Renaissance had armed Europe with a new kind of weapon. Thought. And thought, once loosed into the world, could not be tamed. It crept into courts and classrooms, into sermons and treaties. The men who held the quill now rivaled those who wore the crown. And their ideas, sometimes soft as parchment, sometimes sharp as iron, reshaped everything. In the wake of Machiavelli, rulers began to govern with eyes wide open. His prints circulated quietly through corridors of power, read behind curtains, whispered between diplomats. Though many condemned its ruthless pragmatism in public, in private they took notes. Better to be feared, he had said, than loved. And those who listened survived. Governance became craft. Power was no longer divine mystery. It was strategy. Alliances were forged not with oaths, but with marriage, coin, and cunning. Courts were no longer just stages for splendor, but theaters of negotiation. The Renaissance statesman, unlike the medieval noble, was measured by wit, not just lineage. Education, too, changed. Where once boys recited catechism and memorized Aristotle in dusty Latin, now they learned how to write persuasively, to speak clearly, to argue well. Grammar schools flourished. Latin remained the language of scholarship, but now alongside rhetoric, history, moral philosophy. The goal was no longer obedience. It was eloquence. The humanists had rewritten the curriculum, and with it, they redefined success. To be educated was to be adaptable, articulate, curious. Women, too, began to find small cracks in the walls of learning. Figures like Isotta Nogarola, Laura Sarita, and Marguerite de Navarre emerged. Writers, poets, patrons, asserting intellect in a world reluctant to see it. Diplomacy, once the domain of bloodlines and brute force, began to rely on letters and learning. Ambassadors quoted Plato, referenced history, spun metaphors. Treaties were drawn not merely with threats, but with arguments. Embassies became listening posts. The political map of Europe, fragmented and fragile, now required thinkers as much as fighters. Even law evolved. Jurists dug into Roman legal texts, comparing them with contemporary needs. The idea of justice became a subject of study. Not only what the law was, but what it should be. The state emerged as a concept beyond the monarch. A body of people, territory laws. Governance became more bureaucratic, more structured, more reasoned, if not always more just. And yet, amid all this clarity, uncertainty festered. The thinkers had cracked open ancient texts and printed new truths, but in doing so, they shook the foundations of belief. If Plato could question the senses, if Montaigne could doubt everything, if Copernicus could move the earth, then what, exactly, was unshakable? The Renaissance had lifted the veil, and behind it was not always certainty, but doubt. Productive doubt, fertile doubt, but doubt nonetheless. Religious tensions, long simmering, boiled over. The Catholic Church, wounded by the Reformation, launched its own counteroffensive. The Council of Trent, convened in 1545, reaffirmed doctrine, reformed abuses, and tightened control over learning. Indexes of forbidden books grew. The Inquisition sharpened. Thought was encouraged, but only within boundaries. Science, too, found itself caught between curiosity and control. For every Vesalius dissecting in public, there were theologians drafting warnings. The universe was growing, and with it, the question of man's place within it. And yet, the thinkers pressed on. Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, in his oration on the dignity of man, declared that humanity was not fixed, but free, able to rise toward the angels or descend into beasts. This freedom, he said, was divine, not as gift, but as responsibility. To think was to choose. To learn was to act. This became the Renaissance's enduring challenge. Not to build cathedrals or write decrees, but to forge men and women capable of living with complexity. The world was no longer flat, simple, divinely ordered. It was layered, conflicted, unpredictable. And yet, it was also possible. Renaissance thought didn't promise utopia. It promised agency. A man could write his fate. A woman could speak her mind. A ruler could learn from history. A peasant could read a book and know he wasn't alone in his wonder. By the mid-1500s, Europe was no longer asleep. It was wide-eyed, restless, and full of contradictions. The thinkers had opened the gates, and the winds of change howled through. Before concrete, before glass towers and steel bones, cities were statements in stone. They whispered the beliefs of the past, echoed the power of kings, and shaped how people moved, prayed, and lived. But in the Renaissance, something shifted. The built world became an intellectual endeavor. Not just shelter, not just spectacle, but a synthesis of mathematics, proportion, and vision. Architecture, once rooted in Gothic spires and crowded ornamentation, was about to be reborn through geometry, order, and human scale. At the center of this shift stood Filippo Brunelleschi, a goldsmith by training, an architect by revolution. In Florence, the Santa Maria del Fiore had waited for a dome for decades. The base was massive. The scale seemed impossible. No scaffolding could reach its peak without collapsing under its own weight. But Brunelleschi, inspired by Roman ruins and armed with sheer stubborn genius, offered a solution. He designed a double shell dome, self-supporting as it rose. No one had ever seen anything like it. He kept the details secret, even from his own team, and built custom machines to lift stone and brick. In 1436, the dome was complete, a feat of engineering that redefined what a human mind could imagine and hands could execute. It didn't just crown Florence's skyline. It crowned the new Renaissance rational, bold, and rooted in ancient wisdom. Architecture now turned its gaze backward to leap forward. Vitruvius, a Roman architect whose treatise De Architectura had been rediscovered, became the guide. He preached three principles: formatus, strength; utilitas, function; and venustus, beauty. Renaissance architects adopted these as sacred. Leon Battista Alberti, a polymath of terrifying intellect, echoed these ideas. In his book, De Reedificatoria, he argued that buildings should reflect harmony, not just visual, but cosmic. The perfect building mirrored the perfect body. Proportions mattered. A window wasn't just light, it was math. A doorway wasn't just entry, it was symbol. Palaces across Italy began to change. Columns, arches, domes, all returned but refined. Gothic was not forgotten, but sidelined. The Renaissance building did not reach for heaven. It stood firmly on earth, serene and balanced. In Rome, Donato Bramante laid plans for St. Peter's Basilica, envisioning a central dome inspired by the Pantheon, a space where man and God might meet on equal architectural terms. Michelangelo, later tasked with completing it, turned the vision into poetry in stone. His dome rose like thought itself, focused, vast, and luminous. But architecture was not limited to churches and courts. Urban planning became a conversation. Streets widened. Plazas opened. Cities like Venice, Florence, and Rome began to think about how people moved through space. Beauty was not confined to palaces. It seeped into fountains, bridges, civic buildings. And alongside architects, a different kind of dreamer emerged: the engineer. Leonardo da Vinci, restless and unsatisfied, filled notebooks with machines. Many never built, but all astounding. He studied gears, pulleys, levers, and hydraulics. He imagined tanks centuries before they rolled across fields. He sketched flying machines with wings shaped like bat bones. He designed bridges that could be deployed by troops in minutes. His machines were art, his art, science. But Leonardo wasn't alone. Francesco di Giorgio Martini, blending warfare with aesthetics, wrote treatises on fortifications. As gunpowder spread, the walls of cities had to adapt. Towers became angled. Bastions emerged. Geometry became defense. And in this world of invention, artisans and architects began sharing space with craftsmen, carpenters, metalworkers, and masons. Studios became laboratories. Drawing became language. The Renaissance studio, once a place for pigment and canvas, now hosted models, drafts, prototypes. The line between artist and scientist blurred. Perspective, too, changed, not just in art, but in how people envisioned the built world. The Renaissance introduced the concept of the ideal city. Designers drew entire towns from birds' eye views, symmetrical, rational, gridded. While few were built, they reflected a desire to impose reason on chaos, to craft order from crowd. In Urbino, Pienza, and parts of Ferrara, the dream took shape. These towns were not accidents of history. They were orchestrated environments, towns with theatres, public squares, coordinated facades. The city itself became a statement. This is what civilization could be. But behind the marble and mortar, behind the columns and codes, was a question: what should the world look like? The Renaissance didn't offer one answer. It offered a framework, a belief that space mattered, that buildings spoke, that what we construct shapes how we think, and vice versa. In doing so, they didn't just give us cathedrals and domes. They gave us the very idea that cities could inspire, that homes could reflect dignity, that public space was sacred. The Renaissance was not merely a revival of old forms. It was a reimagining of how the world could function. From domes that floated in the air to machines that mimicked the body, the studio became a forge where future and fantasy intertwined. Artisans, scientists, architects, and thinkers blurred into one. And with them, the very idea of invention began to change. The great minds of the era did not work in isolation. They moved between courts and cities, commissioned by dukes, financed by merchants, admired by scholars. Florence, Milan, Rome, Venice. These were not just places of wealth, but crucibles of ideas. Every fresco painted, every machine sketched. Every stone laid was a dialogue between ambition and possibility. Leonardo da Vinci remains the most emblematic figure of this fusion. While famed for The Last Supper and Mona Lisa, his notebooks tell a fuller story. There he dissected corpses to understand muscle movement. He built models of hydraulic systems. He drew detailed plans for machines of war and peace, flying devices, water pumps, even diving suits. Though many remained unbuilt, their accuracy and imagination showed a mind centuries ahead. What drove Leonardo was not fame or fortune. It was curiosity. Deep, relentless, obsessive. He saw the patterns of life in rivers, veins, gears, and clouds. For him, the world was a machine of divine design, waiting to be understood by observation and reason. This shift, from revelation to experimentation, was central to the Renaissance revolution in engineering and science. The emphasis was no longer solely on inherited wisdom from antiquity or scripture, but on empirical understanding. In Padua, Girolamo Cardano worked on probability and mechanics, laying early groundwork for mathematics in motion. Giambattista della Porta, in Naples, wrote about optics and natural magic, blending superstition with the earliest seeds of experimental science. And across Europe, alchemists began drifting toward chemistry, astrologers toward astronomy. The studio, once a painter's realm, evolved into something broader, a workshop, a laboratory, a thinking chamber. Apprentices did not just mix paints. They measured, sketched, theorized. Workshops became centers of practical learning. Art became investigation. Craft became discovery. Architecture, too, responded to engineering's rise. Bridges, aqueducts, mills. These were not glamorous projects, but they changed lives. Cities began implementing infrastructure, sewers, water systems, paved roads. Venice improved its canals. Florence built reservoirs and water wheels. Rome expanded its ruins into modern utilities. Even in warfare, engineering reshaped the battlefield. The invention of gunpowder forced architects to rethink fortifications. Walls were no longer vertical and proud. They became angled, sunken, and broad, designed to absorb cannon fire. The star fort was born. Geometry turned into survival. Engineers worked with generals. Mathematicians sat beside mercenaries. Science had entered the fray. One key figure in this transformation was Leonardo's rival, Michelangelo's contemporary, Leon Battista Alberti. Though famed as an architect and writer, he also designed cryptographic devices, studied mechanics, and explored the potential of optical illusions in art and architecture. His understanding of balance, symmetry, and harmony fed directly into structural design. Meanwhile, Francesco di Giorgio Martini wrote extensively on military engineering, proposing cities as defensible systems. His treatises, copied and spread, shaped the urban defenses of Renaissance Europe for decades. Beyond Italy, these ideas spread. In Germany, Konrad Kaiser authored Bella Fortis, a richly illustrated book of siege machines, cannons, and military innovations. In France, engineers began constructing bridges using prefabricated elements. Across the Low Countries, water control systems were modernized, helping manage the flood-prone terrain. The Renaissance mind saw no line between imagination and engineering. A dome, a drawing, a flying machine. They were all answers to the same question: how can we shape the world better? And underlying it all was a new attitude: optimism. That humans, through reason and creativity, could master nature, understand its laws, and apply them for progress. This optimism did not ignore hardship. The cities still suffered from plague, war, and famine. But within their workshops, people were building a different future. Not yet real, but increasingly possible. The Renaissance gave the world more than cathedrals and paintings. It gave systems. of thought, of design, of problem solving. It gave us the blueprint for modern science, engineering, architecture, and even bureaucracy. The studio had become the seedbed of innovation, and in this revolution, beauty was never forgotten. Even the most practical tools bore elegance. Even the most defensive walls carried symmetry. To the Renaissance mind, function and form were not enemies. They were lovers dancing in stone and ink. It began with maps, not perfect ones, speculative, circular, filled with sea monsters and mythical lands, but maps nonetheless. They whispered of possibilities. Lands beyond the edge, gold beyond the hills, empires waiting to be discovered or claimed. The Renaissance had ignited a hunger for knowledge, but that hunger wasn't just intellectual. It was economic, political, and deeply human. As cities grew richer and merchants more ambitious, the horizons of Europe expanded. The age of exploration was not born from curiosity alone. It was born from desire for spices, silk, salvation, and silver. Portugal led the charge. Nestled against the Atlantic, with little land to expand into, it turned to the sea. Under Prince Henry the Navigator, explorers began inching down the west coast of Africa. It was slow, dangerous work. Headwinds, reefs, sickness. But by the time of Bartholomew Dias, they reached the southern tip, the Cape of Good Hope. A new route to the east was within reach. Then came Vasco da Gama, who in 1498 sailed around Africa and reached Calicut in India. It was not a voyage of fantasy. It was business. Da Gama returned with cargo worth 60 times the cost of the trip. Lisbon exploded with wealth. Spices flowed, gold gleamed, and Portugal began carving out an empire, not inland, but coastal, dotted with forts and ports from Brazil to go to Malacca. Not to be outdone, Spain looked west. In 1492, Christopher Columbus, sailing under the Spanish crown, crossed the Atlantic. He believed he had reached Asia. In truth, he had stumbled upon a continent unknown to Europe. The Caribbean became the gateway, and soon, Cortés and Pizarro would shatter the empires of the Aztecs and Incas, returning with gold, tales of temples, and maps redrawn with every voyage. The riches were staggering. Ships returned heavy with silver from Potosi, sugar from the Caribbean, and slaves from West Africa. The Columbian Exchange reshaped the world. Maize, potatoes, tobacco, tomatoes, all flowed into Europe. Horses, cattle, wheat, and disease flowed out. But behind the glitter was conquest, and behind conquest, violence. The Renaissance mind that had built domes and dreamed in perspective now turned its gaze on entire continents. Native cultures, rich with their own knowledge and systems, were often dismissed as primitive. Lands were declared empty, people disposable. The same rationality that measured the stars was used to measure human worth, and often found it wanting. Maps became tools of empire. The blank spaces were not mysteries, they were invitations. Lines were drawn not to reflect reality, but to define ownership. The world was being claimed in ink before it was even known. In Italy, cartographers like Fra Mauro and later Mercator revolutionized mapmaking. Mercator's projection, though distorted, made navigation easier. It turned the spherical world into flat logic, and with it, explorers could plan, measure, divide. Navigation improved. The astrolabe, compass, and improved nautical charts turned guesswork into precision. Portuguese and Spanish shipbuilders perfected the caravel. Light, fast, capable of tacking into the wind. With every voyage, new techniques emerged. The ocean, once feared, became a road. Back in Europe, tales of the New World flooded print shops. Books, letters, and illustrations painted lands of endless bounty, strange beasts, and foreign peoples. The Renaissance public, hungry for marvels, devoured them. Some saw opportunity, others saw warning. Not all agreed on the morality of conquest. Bartolomé de las Casas, a Spanish friar, condemned the brutality of colonization. He wrote of massacres, forced labor, and the destruction of native civilizations. His words sparked debate, not silence. The Valladolid debate in 1550 was one of the first formal moral discussions on colonization and on whether indigenous peoples had souls, rights, reason. But empire marched on. Trade networks exploded. Sugar plantations, fueled by enslaved Africans, transformed the Caribbean. The Atlantic slave trade, soon a monstrous machine, turned human bodies into cargo. Still, not all exploration was conquest. Magellan's fleet circumnavigated the globe. Though he died in the Philippines, his ships proved the Earth's vastness and unity. Cabot, Verrazano, Cartier, all ventured into the northern coasts, searching for new passages, new fortunes. And all the while, Europe transformed. Capital flowed, cities swelled. Ports like Antwerp, Lisbon, and Seville became global crossroads. Merchants became kings in all but name. The Renaissance had reached beyond art and intellect. It had become maritime, oceanic, imperial. The sails had billowed, the ships had landed, and the maps had grown teeth. By the mid-1500s, exploration was no longer an act of curiosity. It was policy, a state function, a corporate venture, a machine, churning seas into silver, forests into sugar, and human lives into statistics. The Renaissance mind, enamored with geometry and precision, now turned toward commerce. Navigation was no longer just a science, it was a business. And the ocean, once a border, had become a highway. Global trade was born. The Portuguese Estado de Senandia connected Go to Lisbon, carrying spices, silks, and porcelain. The Spanish treasure fleets, laden with silver from the Americas, became lifelines of empire. Caravans once trudging across deserts were now rivaled by ships slicing through waves. Venice and Genoa, long dominant through overland routes, found their power challenged by Atlantic ports. The commercial revolution reshaped Europe. Banking houses, once local, began handling international transfers. Insurance firms arose in the wake of stormy losses. Joint stock companies, like the Dutch East India Company, and later the British, would formalize global trade into cold strategy. Risk was no longer personal. It was investment. But with profit came dehumanization. People were counted, priced, and chained. The transatlantic slave trade, fueled by European demand for labor, became the darkest artery of Renaissance expansion. Africans were captured, sold, branded, and shipped across oceans like commodities. The triangle forwarded European goods to Africa, slaves to the Americas, sugar and silver back to Europe. The Renaissance, for all its refinement, had not outgrown cruelty. It had simply systematized it, and yet, amidst the violence, ideas traveled too. Plants, animals, languages, and beliefs leapt continents. Maize and potatoes reshaped European diets. Wheat and livestock transformed American landscapes. Disease, especially smallpox, devastated indigenous populations, sometimes wiping out entire civilizations. But not all exchanges were deadly. Words, recipes, tools, and crafts moved with the wind. Music mixed. Fashion changed. Cultures, even under the shadow of empire, spoke to one another. Europe itself began to shift. The influx of silver inflated prices and destabilized economies. Traditional elites struggled to keep pace with merchant wealth. Cities like Antwerp, Amsterdam, and Seville became economic engines. With trade came art, maps, charts, and navigational instruments turned into objects of fascination. Cabinets of curiosity filled with coral, feathers, idols, and bones The world was becoming collectible, and knowledge, once confined to scriptoria and universities, began to adapt. Botanists categorized exotic plants. Cartographers redrew the earth with every voyage. Cosmographers debated longitude and currents. The first stirrings of anthropology emerged, clumsy and biased, but real. Writers like Montaigne questioned what it meant to be civilized. Were the so-called savages truly beneath them, or simply different? In Spain, the school of Salamanca, led by thinkers like Francisco de Vitoria, began laying foundations for international law. Could a king claim land simply by planting a flag? Did indigenous peoples have sovereignty? These were questions born from ships, but answered in classrooms. Meanwhile, resistance brewed. In the Americas, native peoples fought back through revolt, escape, or silent endurance. In Africa, kingdoms negotiated, traded, and at times pushed against European intrusion. The story was never one-sided. Even in domination, cultures adapted, reshaped, endured. Back in Europe, the age of exploration left a mark on the imagination. Painters filled canvases with fantastical beasts and distant lands. Playwrights set stories in, real and imagined. The ocean became myth, metaphor, and mirror. It was freedom and danger, wealth and ruin. The Renaissance mind, which had once marveled at domes and diagrams, now turned outward, and the world responded, not with silence, but with noise, conflict, and transformation. By the late 1500s, no kingdom in Europe could pretend it was alone. The world had become connected. By trade, by war, by disease, by hope. The Renaissance had begun in books and basilicas. It now stretched across oceans, stamped on silver, echoing in foreign tongues. A world that had been bound by parchment and pulpit was beginning to split at the seams. The old certainties no longer held. The stars no longer orbited Earth. The church no longer monopolized truth. The human mind, once told to kneel before mystery, now dared to question, to dissect, to doubt. This was not rebellion for its own sake. It was awakening. A slow, thrilling, terrifying realization that knowledge could be tested, that authority could be wrong, that man, frail and brief, could still uncover the workings of the heavens. It began with the sky. Nicolaus Copernicus, quiet, calculating, polished, spent decades refining a single idea, that the earth moved, not the sun, not the firmament, the earth. His model placed the sun at the center and the planets in orbit. He hesitated to publish, knowing it would provoke, confuse, offend. When he did, in 1543, his book De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium unsettled the universe. It did not spark immediate revolution, but the seed was planted, a crack in the celestial dome. Then came Johannes Kepler, who refined the model with elliptical orbits. Tycho Brahe, who charted the stars with naked eyes and iron discipline. And above them all, Galileo Galilei, who turned a telescope skyward and dared to say what he saw. Mountains on the moon, moons orbiting Jupiter, imperfection in the heavens. Galileo published, argued, and faced the wrath of power. He was forced to recant, but he had seen, and what was seen could not be unseen. Below the stars, the earth itself became a subject of inquiry. William Harvey studied the body, discovering that blood circulated, not sloshed, pumped by the heart in a closed loop. Andres Vesalius, with scalpel in hand, challenged ancient texts by opening corpses. His illustrations, precise and brutal, replaced superstition with anatomy. Francis Bacon, English philosopher, proposed a new method: observe, experiment, repeat. He called for a break from blind tradition. The mind, he said, must be disciplined, its biases broken, its senses sharpened. Knowledge should serve man, not mystify him. Across the Channel, René Descartes offered a different clarity. He doubted everything. But from that doubt, he found a foundation: cogito, ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. From that certainty, he rebuilt the world through logic and reason. He dissected motion, optics, and the mind itself, and in doing so, helped usher a new age of rationalism. But this age was no smooth ascension. The mind was cracking open. Yes, but so was the world. Certainty gave way to ambiguity. For every discovery, a destabilization. For every answer, more questions. If Earth was not the center, then where was man? If the stars could be measured, could the soul? If truth was no longer singular, how did one live? The Renaissance had taught man to observe beauty. Now it demanded he confront complexity. Printing presses spread ideas faster than swords. Books that once took years now took days. And with each new copy, knowledge multiplied. And so did doubt. The mind became a battlefield between old loyalties and new understandings. Science was not yet the clean method we imagine. It was entangled with mysticism, alchemy, philosophy. But the trajectory was clear. Knowledge would no longer be inherited. It would be earned. In cities like Paris, Leiden, Padua, and London, academies and societies formed. Observations were shared. Experiments repeated. Instruments refined. The air buzzed with hypotheses, debates, inventions, telescopes, barometers, microscopes. Even the language of truth changed. Mathematics, once a theoretical plaything, became the syntax of the universe. Numbers described motion. Geometry mapped the heavens. Algebra predicted the invisible. This wasn't just a transformation of knowledge. It was a transformation of identity. The individual, once defined by birth, faith, or guild, now found meaning in thought. A man might be poor, obscure, even heretical, and yet change the world through intellect. The mind became a realm of sovereignty. And yet, in all this motion, the Renaissance did not forget its beginning. The human being. In this new age of reason, the individual was still central, not as a passive observer, but as an agent, not as a subject of divine drama, but as an explorer of nature, history, and self. The modern mind, skeptical, curious, methodical, was being born, not in one place, not in one moment, but across workshops, libraries, observatories. It was a collective act of will, wonder, and work. The Renaissance had begun with the rediscovery of old texts. It was ending by creating entirely new worlds. Ideas, once whispered, candlelit corners, now rang from the mouths of scholars, spilled from the hands of printers, echoed in the minds of merchants and kings. The walls that had divided faith and fact, tradition and transformation, were cracking, not from a single blow, but from pressure, persistent and growing. In salons, academies, and private chambers, people gathered not just to worship or trade, but to argue about the cosmos, the state, the soul. Truth was no longer an inheritance, it was a pursuit. As the Renaissance mind matured, it no longer looked only to the stars or the scriptures for answers. It looked inward and outward, and through the lens of skepticism began reassembling the world. The Reformation had already shaken the religious foundation of Europe. Now, this growing storm of reason began to gnaw at the foundations of society itself. Hierarchies, once blessed and unquestioned, became subjects of analysis. Monarchs, priests, nobles, none were beyond critique. In Italy, Machiavelli, cynical and sharp, had already proposed that power was its own logic. His Prince was not a sermon on virtue, but a manual for control. Cold, rational, real. In France, Montaigne penned essays that wandered through doubt, mortality, and culture, never claiming certainty, always circling truth. And as these minds turned their gaze toward government, the question became impossible to ignore. Who should rule? And why? The answers were no longer confined to lineage or divine right. Contract theory, republicanism, natural rights. These seeds were being planted. Slowly, quietly. But they would soon erupt into fire. The scientific method, which demanded evidence, repeatability, and logic, began to bleed into politics, into economics, into society. Could a nation be governed like a body, balanced like an equation, reformed like an experiment? And so, thinkers like Thomas Hobbes emerged, arguing that without order, life was brutish and short. But that even sovereigns drew power from consent, not the heavens. Others, like John Locke, would later push further that liberty was not granted by rulers, but born within man. These were not yet revolutions, but they were sparks. And everywhere, institutions began to shift. Universities, once beholden to theology, now opened chairs in mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. Scientific societies, such as the Accademia dei Lincei in Italy, or later the Royal Society in England, provided structure to inquiry, peer review, documentation, skepticism. Science became collaborative. Printing, which had once accelerated the spread of Bibles, now printed treatises, pamphlets, and arguments. Literacy spread. Ideas travelled faster than armies, and with each new edition, the old order seemed more fragile. Even art, so central to the Renaissance, began to reflect this shift. Portraits showed thinkers, not just nobles. Engravings documented machines, dissections, discoveries. The divine still loomed, but it shared space now with man, alone, thinking. The calendar, the clock, the map, all tools once imprecise, now sharpened by science, remade how people lived. Time was no longer measured in bells, but in hours. Space no longer in law, but in latitude. The world, once mythic, became measurable. Yet with all this advancement came unease. Was the soul just an illusion? Was the universe cold and clockwork? Did certainty even exist? These doubts did not paralyze the Renaissance mind. They propelled it. It sought meaning not in collapsing into dogma, but in pushing forward. The path of knowledge was no longer upward toward revelation, but outward in every direction, into the microscope, across the sea, beneath the skin, beyond the stars, and all around. The old world watched, suspicious, resisting, transforming. The church condemned books and burned thinkers, but it also began to adapt, funding observatories, engaging in debate. Monarchs feared the printing press, but used it for propaganda. Merchants resisted new ideas, yet bankrolled new inventions. The world was shifting, not in an instant, not with a scream, but with 1,000 voices, pens, and questions. The Renaissance had opened the door. The modern mind walked through it. This was not yet the Enlightenment. That storm would come next. But the clouds were gathering. The wind was rising. And the minds shaped in the studios, cathedrals, and laboratories of the Renaissance would soon remake the earth. Not through conquest alone, but through concept. It did not end with a bang. The Renaissance, like the tide, receded slowly. Its edges blurred by the arrival of new ages, new wars, new questions. But it left behind traces too deep to erase. Not monuments alone, not only domes and canvases, but a way of seeing. A whisper in the mind, what if we asked more? What if we reached further? From the scattered republics of Italy to the royal courts of France and Spain, the ideas born in that strange and luminous era had begun to crystallize. Europe would change shape in the coming centuries, but it would do so along paths the Renaissance had drawn. One of the clearest of those paths was science. The careful observations of Copernicus, Galileo, and Kepler would pass into the hands of Isaac Newton. who would synthesize their insights into a single, magnificent system. The world, he showed, moved not by whim or miracle, but by laws, gravity, motion, inertia. The apple fell not because it was commanded, but because it must. This mechanistic vision would reign for centuries. The cosmos became a vast clock, its gears spinning in silence. Certainty returned, not from scripture, but from equations. But the Renaissance had not only given birth to science, it had given birth to the idea that truth could be pursued by anyone. This idea, fragile, powerful, began to spread. As monarchs tightened their grip, as churches sought to reassert control, a new kind of resistance took shape. In salons, letters, and underground presses, people began to speak of liberty, reason, equality. The dream of the Renaissance, that the individual mattered, that knowledge was power, that beauty and truth were kin, returned. Now sharper, more political. These seeds would bloom in the Enlightenment, but their roots ran deep into the Renaissance soil. And what of the arts? The harmony and perspective born in Florence and Venice became the standard for centuries. Baroque architecture would magnify Renaissance principles into theatrical grandeur. Classical music would carry its balanced spirit into sound. Literature, freed from strict allegory, would explore the self, the flawed, the real. Even empires, rising and falling, carried its echoes. The colonial expansions of the 17th and 18th centuries wore Renaissance rationalism like armor. Justifications were drawn from maps and measurements. The tragedy of conquest was often cloaked in the language of progress. But not all echoes were noble. The same Renaissance curiosity that peered through telescopes also measured skulls. The same hunger for classification that birthed botany also laid the groundwork for racial theories. The legacy was not clean. It was vast and conflicted. Yet still at its heart, the Renaissance had offered a profound reorientation. Before it, knowledge flowed downward, from divine to priest, from priest to people. After it, knowledge began to flow outward, in every direction. The printing press shattered hierarchy. The artist became thinker. The merchant became patron. The thinker became citizen. It was not a perfect era. It was not pure, but it had motion and momentum. It whispered, "The world can be studied. The body can be understood. The soul can be questioned. The mind, once shackled, can stretch its wings." And across time, that whisper grew. It lingered, not in stone or parchment alone, but in the way a generation approached the world, with head tilted toward the stars and hands stained with ink, clay, and iron. The Renaissance did not vanish. It dissolved into everything, like pigment into water, tinting the ages that followed with its hue. Its echoes rang through revolution. In France, the salons of Paris filled with voices, citing not just Rousseau and Voltaire, but also the earlier flamebearers, Petrarch, Erasmus, Machiavelli. Their inheritance was not only the Enlightenment's reason, but the Renaissance's belief in the human mind's power to reshape the world. Kings fell. The people, once subjects, became citizens. And though blood would stain the streets, the idea had taken root. That man might govern himself, not through dogma, but through deliberation. In America, the founding fathers built not only with laws, but with ideals traced back through the long corridors of Renaissance thought. Liberty, self-determination, progress, civic virtue. These were not born in a day. They were refined over centuries, and their crucible had been Florence, Padua, and Venice. In science, the legacy evolved into revolution. From Newton's precision came fields that bent reality, electricity, magnetism, thermodynamics. Then the world split open again. Darwin's evolution, Einstein's relativity, Heisenberg's uncertainty. Each challenged the notion of permanence. Each followed the Renaissance impulse to question what had been assumed. Even as Europe marched into the industrial age, belching coal and forging steel, the Renaissance spirit lingered. In the curiosity of engineers, the elegance of mathematicians, the defiant pride of poets. In the 19th century, it was reborn again in Romanticism, a reaction to cold rationalism, a return to passion, individuality, nature. Painters like Delacroix, writers like Goethe and Byron, composers like Beethoven, they burned with the same fire that lit Michelangelo's ceiling or Da Vinci's notebooks. They believed, still, in the depth of the individual soul. But the Renaissance did not belong only to Europe. Its impact, via conquest, trade, translation, touched the globe. The printing press reshaped cultures from Istanbul to Delhi. Renaissance texts were studied in Cairo, debated in Fez, translated in Timbuktu. The exchange was uneven, often violent, but not one-sided. The world was watching and responding, and today, its echoes are everywhere. In every artist who breaks from tradition, in every student who questions their teacher, in every scientist who draws connections where others see chaos, in every citizen who demands to speak, to vote, to be counted. The Renaissance lives in the act of learning itself, in the refusal to settle, in the hunger to know, in the dignity of thought. Its spirit haunts the museum, the library, the lab, the studio, the courtroom, and the street. Not as ghost, but as ancestry. It reminds us that humanity's greatest revolutions often begin not with war, but with a whisper. What if? What if the earth moves? What if I paint what I see? What if I build what hasn't been imagined? What if I, small, mortal, ordinary, could understand the cosmos? It began in narrow alleys and candlelit chapels. It grew in studios and studies, in sweat and brushstrokes and blood. And it ended, or rather, continued, as a new kind of fire, passed hand to hand through the centuries. This was the Renaissance, not an era, a turning. And we are still turning.